The Resident Evil 3 remake perfectly encapsulates, in a way, the spirit of the original Resident Evil 3. Resident Evil 3 came at a time when the series was expanding. The identity of the series was in flux, and the game that came to be Resident Evil 3 showed a distinct but somewhat confused spirit. It was action-packed, throwing a lot more ammo at the player and even adding a counter move. But it was still operating on a fundamentally horror-oriented foundation, with its fixed camera, tank controls, and limited inventory space. Resident Evil 3 represents the crossroads moment where either the horror or the action was going to win out. And comparing the sales of the first game's remake to the sales of Resident Evil 4 will tell you exactly how that went. In much the same way, the Resident Evil 3 remake, which I'll be calling 3make for simplicity's sake, is self-contradicting. It's using the same fundamental systems as the remake of 2, which I'll call 2make, but in a much different context. 3make is an almost entirely linear thrill ride, with set pieces coming one after the other as you fly through areas without a second thought. The most explorative area of the game, the starting downtown section, lasts maybe 30 minutes if you're taking your time. After that section, it's a straight shot through linear areas until the very end, and you're not likely to run out of ammo at any point. There's even a Bayonetta dodge which grants slow motion and auto-aim if timed perfectly. And yet, we're still doing the 2make thing where zombies are super tough and easier to kneecap and run past than straight up kill. It takes a second of standing still for your aim to settle to a precision dot on the crosshair. Enemies still lurch around in sudden ways so as to make landing your shots that little bit harder. And yet, after having played both the original and the remake back to back, the original stands tall as a cohesive whole where the remake doesn't. And no, that isn't nostalgia speaking. I had never played the original Resident Evil 3 until after the remake came out, which I did for the sake of this video, not expecting it to be all that great, but I was pleasantly surprised. Resident Evil 3 is, even 20 years removed from its release, a pretty damn good game, maybe even my favorite of the PS1 trilogy, which I just marathoned from start to finish. It's action-focused, but retains the explorative gameplay all the way through, albeit the opening city section is the largest area in the game, as it is in the remake. And so, unfortunately, I'm charting a trajectory of these remakes that doesn't say anything good. The original remake is outright superior to the original Resident Evil. I doubt you'll find many people who disagree that RE1 has mostly been made obsolete as anything other than an important part of game's history. 2make is arguably better than the original 2, but I can absolutely see a case either way. I don't think 2make replaces its source material. 3make, as the third act in this downward line, is almost certainly worse than the original. The easiest evidence I can provide is, funny enough, the change in title. The PlayStation original is Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, whereas the remake drops the Nemesis subtitle. At first glance, this could be written off as just a way of creating consistency between the titles of the remakes. No subtitle, it's just Resident Evil and then a number on the end if it's a sequel. But if I can take a moment to whip out my conspiracy brain, I think it's more than that. Because 3make's Nemesis is just plain lame. I'm tempted to say that Nemesis was removed from the title because the devs knew he was a lesser element compared to the original. Whether his less interesting role was on purpose or incidental is up to interpretation, but as it stands, he's only about as interesting as Mr. X. And I mean the original Mr. X, not 2make's excellent recreation of Mr. X. Where the original Nemesis chased you throughout the game in a variety of locations and in organic ways, this Nemesis has exactly one organic stalker sequence, and it's the very first one. Once you've left the downtown section of the game, Nemesis will never again chase you outside of scripted set pieces wherein you run from him until you reach safety or a boss fight. And it's a shame, because that downtown stalker sequence is really good. Running around the streets with your newly acquired lockpick and trying to grab all the extra items as he chases you down works really well, barring his refusal to enter certain rooms and buildings. At its best moments, it feels like the upgrade to the original that it should, with Nemesis being twice as threatening to match Jill having twice the mobility. You can even down him for extra handgun parts, same as you could in the original, but this time he doesn't stay down. This version of Nemesis, the moments you spend with him out in an open environment, feel like they're from an alternate universe version of the remake which was absolutely fantastic. And, by contrast, all of his appearances afterward feel like the bad joke answer you'd give if someone asked you how a remake could screw up Nemesis. After the 2 handgun parts you can get from him, optionally downing Nemesis never again grants similar upgrades, only a small number of supplies that are never worth the ammo expended to get them. Anytime Nemesis appears after the downtown section, you are in borderline zero danger. The only threats he ever presents from then on are his first and last boss fights, and that's solely due to the shoddy implementation of the Bayonetta dodge. It feels as though it always comes out just a bit later than when you wanted it to, and as a result, Nemesis' ability to take you down to almost no health with a single hit, even on normal difficulty, becomes extremely frustrating. This is paired with the fact that he's not content to hit you once and let you get up, but rather, he likes to immediately move in and wind up a second swing while you're still getting up. So you can either frantically slam the menu button to try and pull out a healing item before he kills you, or you can frantically slam the dodge button and try to avoid the hitbox. Now granted, Nemesis liked to do something similar in the original, but there he did relatively low damage, and you could get up faster by mashing buttons and potentially escape his second attack. Here, unless you're extremely confident in your last second dodges, you're likely to get frustrated as Jill seemingly refuses to start moving out of the way until she's an arbitrary number of inches off the ground. Now that's not to say the dodge in the original was perfect, far from it, but the original's dodge wasn't leaned upon as a vital mechanic. It was more like a bonus mastery mechanic to learn as you played the game more, and which could occasionally help you out if you happened to accidentally trigger it in combat. Whereas here, unless you've got a thumb on that spacebar at all times and know where its weird active frames are, you're going to be eating a face full of Nemesis meat and taking a lot of damage in the process. And I wouldn't be yammering on about this mechanic were it not the only significant new mechanic added to fit the focus on action. The original added the quick turn button at the very least, which this game also has, but I mean, what's the point in a third-person game? The wonky dodge maybe isn't so bad on the lower difficulties, but once you've gone past hardcore and hit Nightmare and Inferno, things become extremely frustrating. Nightmare unlocks once you've beaten hard mode, then Inferno unlocks once you've beaten Nightmare, and I really wanted to love these modes. On the surface, they carry my Bayonetta comparison even further, going beyond number tweaking and actually making substantive changes to the campaign. Like Bayonetta's higher difficulties, Nightmare and Inferno remix enemy placement, generally throw more zombies at you when zombies are around, and sometimes place harder enemies in earlier areas. Nemesis' parasite zombies, for example, appear even before he does, unlike the lower difficulties. Turning the corner into the game's first alley and seeing a whole crowd of zombies that you'll need to flashbang and run past, rather than the two you can easily dispatch on lower difficulties, is really exciting. But unfortunately, for a few reasons, these changes become both negligible and frustrating. First off, Nightmare and Inferno hand you a magnum in the first real room of the game to offset the difficulty, meaning blowing away those harder enemies and downing Nemesis is no more difficult than before. Second, the increased number of enemies rarely affects anything. Once you've cleared the downtown area, you'll be so stocked on grenades, launcher rounds, and ammo in general that the enemy numbers hardly matter. Third, many of these new enemies come in scripted sequences you'll be either running past or blasting through regardless based on what the game wants from you. So what starts as an increased challenge really just becomes spending 20 of your 200 bullets instead of 15 of them. All of which might be fine if Remake retained the explorative gameplay that made it tense to return to rooms and find new enemies there, but as mentioned, the game is almost a total rail. But that's all less important than the real issue, and that's that Remake just isn't a mechanically intensive game. And to be fair, neither is 2Make, or Remake, or any of the classic Resident Evils. The challenge has always come from efficiency, your ability to get through the game using as little as possible as fast as possible. High skill runs of Resident Evil aren't about fancy shooting so much as efficient and well executed routing. This isn't Bayonetta, where the skill ceiling comes from your ability to perform 10 actions at once, all while planning your next 10 actions and changing plans the second circumstances change. Every single one of Bayonetta's difficulties makes drastic changes to the gameplay that pushes your mechanical skill. When you first play Bayonetta on normal mode, it feels like a massive challenge. Then you play hard, which forces you into crazy hard enemy encounters all the time, and normal feels like it was a tutorial by comparison. Then you play Non-Stop Infinite Climax, which takes away witch time and makes hard feel like a tutorial by comparison. And you discover more and more complexity to the combat that feels incredible to put together. Remake, by comparison, forces you into harder enemy encounters that change in no way, because Jill's combat options start and end the same way. You can dodge, and you can shoot. You can get a bit better at dodging and shooting, but nothing is a revelation. As a result, normal enemy encounters feel no different on Inferno than they do on any other difficulty, whereas boss fights are infuriating. Unless you're carrying both of the unlockable defense coins, Nemesis will one-shot you with certain attacks on the higher difficulties. On max difficulty, even with both of those defense coins equipped, Final Nemesis can and will combo you to death with his ground slam. If you're hit by the first because of the wonky dodge, you will be smashed from full health to dead. Unless you aren't. Because in addition to being an annoying insta-death, it's also extremely inconsistent. On completely separate attempts at the boss, I could be hit by the exact same ground slam, yet one run I'd be smashed to death, while on the other I'd mysteriously get just enough time to dodge out after 1 or 2 hits. I have no idea why it works this way, but I'd prefer to take my instant kill and be done with it rather than being allowed to falsely hope that I'll be able to escape a death combo. It tempted me to take those defense coins off for the sake of not having to watch all the animations each time I was being comboed, even though that would only make me die more easily to other attacks. These 2 fights stand in stark contrast to his second and third fights, where he's pathetically easy to dodge and doesn't even do enough damage to require the defense coins. The second has a stupid condition that I didn't figure out until replaying the game because it requires bringing a specific weapon and a specific ammo type, but it was still dead easy, with or without. Those aforementioned defense coins come from the post-game shop, where you can use points acquired from in-game challenges to buy upgrades, or one measly costume. Those challenges range from things as simple as clearing the game on normal, all the way up to S-ranking Inferno, beating the game without using the item box, beating the game without healing items, and so on. More difficult challenges will grant you more points, and more useful items are more expensive. In some ways, this is flat out better than the way Resident Evil usually handles this stuff, requiring you to perform a specific task to get a specific item. Instead, you can modify what rewards you get based on what you find more useful. I chose extra inventory space rather than increased damage, for example, since I'm a hoarder in these games. But there are 2 critical flaws here which hamper the system, and they both feel strangely avoidable. First, many of the challenges that grant the most points can be done on the easiest difficulty. Getting an S rank, clearing the game in less than 2 hours, clearing the game without healing, and clearing the game without the item box can all easily be done in a single easy mode run. And once you've done that, you can buy basically everything other than the infinite weapons. This could have been avoided by not allowing these challenges to be completed below a certain difficulty. Second, you can easily save up for the infinite rocket launcher, which absolutely decimates the game on any difficulty. I limited myself to just the infinite pistol until I'd cleared Inferno, since the pistol becomes irrelevant pretty quickly in the campaign, but I could easily have farmed achievements to get the infinite launcher long before then, making the increased difficulty of Nightmare and Inferno utterly irrelevant just by running through the game a few times on easy. I haven't used it, but I can't imagine the infinite assault rifle is significantly less effective for demolishing the difficulty either. This could have been fixed by the aforementioned point rebalancing, making it hard or impossible to get without doing the game's most difficult challenges first. Or the more powerful infinite weapons could have been an exception, only being unlocked by 100%ing the game rather than through points. What makes all this worse is that no shop item, including the infinite rocket launcher, prevents you from unlocking achievements or reaching the highest rank in the campaign. I could, if I wanted to, load up my game right now and blaze through Inferno with the infinite launcher in 1 hour and be rewarded with the game's hardest achievements and an S rank, but I just can't be bothered. I blasted through the game once or twice with the launcher on lower difficulties and only stopped after realizing how insanely bored I was. You could always restrict yourself to not using certain items while rank chasing, but I don't hand out points to a game for letting the player fix its problems for it. 2make disallowed the use of infinite weapons while going for the highest rank. Why doesn't 3make? Why doesn't 3make have an S+ rank like 2make did, for that matter? 2make isn't a perfect game, I'm willing to admit its faults. The bosses are weak, the sewers are a drag, and Mr. X had some arguably unfair behavior. But above all else, the game felt polished. Whether or not you think it's fair that Mr. X teleports once or twice for the sake of a scare, the developers no doubt thought long and hard about whether or not those moments were justified. With door transitions removed, Mr. X looked silly, poking his head into a safe room and refusing to come in.
Oh, I guess I'll go back upstairs. Wait a second! You get back here, little lady! Where'd she go? She must have gone back up the stairs. I must tend to my books. It's a good thing she's not Wait a second. Claire, return your books to the library. Where'd she go?
But I completely understood why the decision was made for him to work that way. 3make, by comparison, feels rushed, and that's not something I wanted to say about it. I knew as soon as it was announced that people would complain the game was rushed, considering its release came only a year after 2make, and I wanted to disagree. But there are moments, both firm and speculatory, that make me feel like the game needed more time. For a firm example, look at the QTEs. They're minor, but also bizarrely inconsistent. Whenever the player is meant to hold the button in question, the game will outright say so and a meter will fill. But for some reason, toward the end of the game, there's a section in which the player is meant to hold a button to advance, yet the indicator is completely different. For some reason, the hold icon is changed to a pulsing icon, which made me think I was meant to be pressing the button in time with the pulses. I quickly figured out that wasn't the case, but why is it that the rules suddenly change for this one part? It feels like two different people implemented two different versions of the hold icon, put them in at different points, and no one asked whether or not the two should match. That's beside the fact that having QTEs at all is the 7th generation caveman approach to creating cinematic action sequences. And if I had to speculate, I think they would have been removed or toned down had the team had more time. Because I mean, why do we have QTEs to reduce damage taken by zombies, yet defensive weapons are out? Is it because Jill has an infinite knife this time around? Because she still has frag grenades and flash grenades, I don't see why she isn't allowed to use those as defensive weapons like you could in Remake. There's even an enemy type based entirely around grabbing the player, which is an instant kill, and the player is handed a frag grenade right before encountering the first one. Why can't Jill shove a frag grenade in its mouth if she gets grabbed? Exchanging an interesting tactical option, like defensive weapons, for an impossible-to-fail QTE damage reduction is the type of decision that would be weeded out during the polishing stage of a AAA game. On top of that, why can I only quick-select the knife if it's in one of my 4 shortcut slots? Now I have to go into my menu to equip them if I'm full up on other weapons. Why is the intro so long? Remake let you blast through its opening in just a couple of minutes, whereas this game has a prolonged intro that you have to go through every time you start up a new game, and it's not even as interactive as Remake's. You just run from Nemesis and dodge a few zombies. Why is this so long? You wanna know how long the original's intro was if you skip the cutscenes? Because this is how the original RE3 started. As much as I love all the detail in Jill's apartment, I did not need a first-person dream sequence, followed by a first-person real-life sequence, followed by a third-person sequence of answering the phone, followed by crash bandicooting away from Nemesis. Why even have all this be interactive if all I'm doing is holding W? All this does is add more unskippable non-gameplay to an already bloated sequence. The original was cinematic and scripted, but it was all killer, no filler. When Nemesis showed up, he didn't fuck around and let you hold W to get to the next cutscene. It's such a pain for replaying the game, and when your game is 3 or 4 hours long and relies so hard on replays, you have to trim every bit of fat you can. Forced walking, repetitive dialogue, it's all a drag. I'm not gonna dog on this game's length, because length has nothing to do with quality, and the classic Resident Evil games have always been quality experiences because they're short, focused, and replayable. But here, outside of some fun stuff to unlock, Remake has the least replay value of any Resident Evil game I've played. Beating the game on the higher difficulties is mostly satisfying, but the unfettered linearity and abundance of lame sequences hampers the fun beyond that. The original lacked the dual campaign feature of the first 2 games, but it substituted it with a wealth of significant choices and randomization. Both the in-your-face choice moments as well as just how you chose to play led to significantly different events that made each playthrough different. On top of that, enemy and item placements would change every time you played, meaning even the minutiae of what was in your inventory was up to chance. Whereas in Remake, everything is static. Higher difficulties may change enemy and item placements, but they're static within those difficulties. One of the things I hoped for most, that Nemesis would appear earlier in downtown, didn't happen either, in spite of how easy it would have been to implement. This is on top of how weak the set pieces are, leading to significant chunks of the game being unchangingly boring. Take this sequence as Carlos, for example, where you defend against waves of enemies busting in through the windows. It's not hard, it's not interesting, and I dreaded it every time I replayed the game, knowing it would last an extremely long time no matter how well I played. And this is where we return to my thesis that this game is torn between action and horror in a way that means neither succeeds. Compare that sequence with Carlos with this sequence from Resident Evil 4. You know the one where the Ganados are busting into a house while you and Luis defend for a set amount of time. It's wild, it's intense, it's one of the best sequences in an already fantastic game. It's almost precisely the same setup, yet Resident Evil 4's version is so much better it's laughable. In fact, the game's emphasis on action means way more enemies are coming at you from way more directions, and you have tons more ways to interact with those enemies getting in, boosting the tension along with the thrills. It's like some sick joke, making a game called Resident Evil 3 that has a lame defense set piece that a game called Resident Evil 4 from 15 years ago did 1,000 times better. Carlos's sections are generally not bad outside of that, better than the originals. Carlos's section in the original is brief and not terribly noteworthy, whereas Remake's Carlos gets a few choice moments. The Horde fight in the RPD is neat, and his encounters with the hunters in the hospital are brief but nerve-wracking. However, I can't help but be annoyed that Carlos is the one who visits the RPD rather than Jill. The RPD revisit in the original functioned both as a throwback to 2 and worked thematically for Jill's character. It's her last hurrah at the old station while everything goes to shit, and she's gathering what she needs before taking off. Fits with the whole last escape thing she has going on throughout. But Carlos has no connection with the RPD, it might as well be any other building to him, and it feels like an opportunity to have Jill encounter a zombified Brad would have been worth the restructuring. It's great to hear the RE2 save theme properly, and in fact 3Make does a much better job with music than 2Make did, but it would have felt better as Jill. In terms of theme and character, 3Make can't help but feel a little bit hollow. The original showed the destruction of Raccoon City so thoroughly that, combined with Jill's sentiments about leaving Raccoon City behind, really hammered home how lost the place was. The trip to the RPD in particular showed the way that Leon and Jill, who were meant to work in the exact same building, were separated by events beyond their control. Jill's journey in 3 is about regaining control of her destiny, both by defeating Nemesis and escaping the city. Her character reflected that well, being headstrong and confident. Her rebirth on the altar of the Clock Tower Chapel is the turning point where she really starts to turn the tables on her situation. Jill Valentine has never been an exceptionally interesting character, but she does have moments in the original, namely her classic final line to Nemesis, which for some reason is shuffled around to the midpoint of the remake. It's thrown into a strangely inappropriate situation too. Nemesis really doesn't even say stars much in this game. I'm not sure why Jill throws it back in his face. 3Make has a lot of strange reinterpretations of classic moments like that, and I think the difference between the two games' endings says a lot. The original ends with Jill luring Nemesis into the path of a mounted rail cannon, followed by the choice to either get away safely or to blow the living shit out of what's left of him with her magnum and delivering a slick one-liner, and it's legitimately cool. 3Make, on the other hand, ends with this 100-pound woman wielding a 500-pound rail cannon, shoving it in Nemesis's mouth, and shouting at him to take the fucking hint. And it's just lame. It's so huge and over the top that it loses meaning, and Jill feels less like the calm, collected badass she was in the original, and more like she's angrily shouting at a pile of meat that she doesn't realize can't hear her. When I heard 3Make was disappointing a lot of critics, I really wanted to be the guy who stood against the crowd. And in some way I can, because I did in the end enjoy 3Make. I wouldn't have bothered with the higher difficulties if there still wasn't some spark of classic RE satisfaction to be found in it. But that spark will only fade the more you play the game, so if you do choose to pick this one up, I recommend playing up through Inferno and then putting it down. Don't chase scores, don't insist on unlocking every single thing, just get your 3 to 4 playthroughs and you'll have gotten your money's worth. Maybe replay it in a year or two when your memory starts to get fuzzy, but don't obsess over it. And make sure to pray with me that they don't actually remake Resident Evil 4. Please? Oh yeah, and I don't care about the stupid Resistance multiplayer mode. Why did they make this, instead of putting mercenaries in the game, or range mode, or anything more significant than difficulty levels? I'm not playing your shitty games as a service Skinner box multiplayer mode that was slapped together to copy every other killer versus survivors game out there. You know why Jill is the first character picked in every round of the survivor team? Because no one wants to play a Resident Evil game as some uncharismatic fucking and nobody character in a sweatshirt. Any and all resources spent on Resistance were wasted, and perfectly emblematic of how this fucking industry works. Deprive your actual game of anything and everything you can, make it as bare bones as possible, then dump all your effort into scamming people out of money with fucking microtransactions. Fuck off, Capcom. Peer-to-peer matchmaking in fucking 2020.